We are going to be on page 368 in the English page numbers, which work strangely for those who are new to our class. The page numbers are a little odd. They seem to go in different directions at once. You'll figure it out. We're on page 368. It reads left to right. The numbers are just weird. Before it used to read right to left, and the numbers were still weird. So we've improved a little bit on our text management. All right, gentlemen, happy Lag BaOmer. We are in the middle of chapter 12, which is the 12th and final chapter of our discourse. And in a way, the best is for last. This chapter, in a way, tackles some of the most abstract and difficult concepts that we're going to be discussing in this discourse. And the discourse generally discusses what is essentially the Chassidic conception of a Jew's obligation of faith. In other words, what does it mean that a Jew has to have faith in God? And it goes through the particulars. So we first explain that faith in God pertains to the infinite aspects of God rather than the finite aspects which can be known through limited intellect. And then we go on to explain various aspects of this, the infinitude of God, and how essentially the Rambam's Ikrim, the Rambam's principles of Judaism about God, all pertain and all either directly speak to, or they imply these transcendent and infinite aspects of the Creator to which a Jew relates through faith. So basically we've been going through, for the past few chapters, near the end of the discourse here, we've been going through various of the Rambam's principles about God. And chapter 11 and chapter 12 are both about the idea that God does not exist within time, that God is above time. That's basically what we're in the middle of discussing. Now, the previous chapter went very far afield. We got very deep into a discussion of the spiritual worlds, and we were explaining the worlds that precede what is normally called the highest world of Atzilus. The highest of the spiritual worlds is really itself preceded by higher worlds. Anybody remember from previous reviews by any chance, the question that causes us to go past Atzilus, to ask what comes before Atzilus? Does anyone remember the general flow?
Yes.
What was the question?
What was the question?
What was the question that brought us to go past Atzilus, or to go higher than Atzilus in our discussion? The initial question was the four worlds and the order of the spiritual worlds generally explain to us the way that an infinite God creates a universe of limitation and with specific particular beings in it, infinitude. And the way that that's able to take place is basically through what are called the 10 spheres, the 10 means of godly expression, the 10, or what are very coarsely called the 10 building blocks of the universe, or the spiritual DNA of the universe. But then we ask the further question, which is, but where do the 10 spheres themselves come from, right? Where does that division come from? We use the 10 the 10 are used to create everything that's within the world, but how do these 10 themselves come from one God? And this itself is a spiritual process, and that is the spiritual process that leads to the world of Atzilus. We explained that at least two levels beyond the world of Atzilus, which are called Akudim and Nakudim, also known as Adam Kadmon and Tehu. This is all review. I'm not getting into all of that now. But long story short, the bottom line of the previous chapter, of chapter 11, is that this highest world that we were discussing, called Akudim, where all of the spheres are united in one expression, and that one expression contains everything. Everything in time and everything in space and everything in the spiritual world. Because the spheres, which are the source for all the worlds, universe is physical and spiritual, the spheres are all included there as one, in one unity. And in that place, the past, present, and future, and everything that exists with its nature exists as one unity, all together. It's not apart. Everything that has ever taken place and everything that will take place exists in the world of Akudim, in the world of Adam Kadmon. As we've said on several occasions, this very class that we're all sitting here and studying this exists in the world of Adam Kadmon. The only thing is that it exists as a unity. And when we say God said, "Let there be light" on the first day of creation, God takes the creation of light, which really corresponds to one of the 10 spheres. All the 10 utterances of creation correspond to the 10 spheres, and he takes that aspect of creation and he unpacks it, he unfolds it, he immanentizes it, he instantiates it into the particular reality of that sphere. And it is this process which is the creation of the world. So everything initially exists in a sort of what you may call a potential state, although we were actually pointing out that it's not really potential, it's actual, but it's in a state of complete unity, whatever the difference between those two things is. So it takes what's in the state of unity, how it's initially created, and God creates from it the actual specific worlds and the specific things within the worlds later on. And the world of Atzilus is really the first stable world where everything, so to speak, is actually created and unfolded and made into a so to speak, a limited and defined creation from that highest spiritual world. All of that is in the previous chapter. This chapter, we said that world of Akudim, that world of Adam Kadmon, where everything is all united together as one, everything is there in a total unity, that world is what we are describing, and we say that God sees the world, the beskira achas. He sees all of time, all 7,000 years of creation. I wish Spencer was here so I could, so that he would have something to say when I said the 7,000 years of creation, that he'll know maybe he knows we're thinking of him. All 7,000 years of creation are included as one in this one glance. God sees it all at a glance. He sees it all as if it's right in front of him right now, all of the time. And then we went on to explain that the 7,000 years are each divided into what are called days, a day corresponding to 1,000 years. We mentioned last time that the 7 days of creation really correspond to the 7,000 years of history, and that there's a lot in Chassidus and Kabbalah that talks about the 7,000 years of history and the way that it's meant to unfold, and how each one of the millennia has a certain particular spiritual energy. And then we explained that those are each divided into smaller, in the process of creation, those are each divided into smaller periods of time. So we have the entire year, and we've discussed before in this class a long time ago about how every year on Rosh Hashanah, on the first day of the year, the entire year, the energy for the entire year exists as one. In other words, this is one of these divisions where the time of the entire year exists in a unity of a year. And then it goes down from years into the Rosh Chodashim, into the beginning of the month, which divide the months up, and then you have the days and the hours, right? The chalakim, the small units of time. Those are the smallest units that have their own individual spiritual energy. So basically, the time precisely down to the moment is every moment is created from a specific spiritual energy, right? It comes from this millennium, and then this year, and this month, this day, this hour, and this moment. And all of these different gradations of time, as they are unpacked, which is a very strange notion, we'll talk about in a moment, these gradations of time, as they are unpacked, each correspond to different arrangements of the spheres. They all exist as one in the world of Akudim, and when God unpacks or unfolds everything as it exists in the unity of Adam Kadmon in the world of Akudim, and he makes everything into an individual creation, that unfolding process also is the creation of time. And time works in this way, through these gradations. Through these different levels of its unfolding. First in thousands of years, then in years, these are gradations in different levels, different amounts. That's what we said last time. And all of these different times correspond to different sfirot, or different names of God, as we said here, different partsufim, because the names of God and the different arrangements of the different names also correspond to the spheres. That's what we said last week. So let's start this week on the bottom of page 368, 2 lines up from the bottom. Ubir ha'inyan. Eich yachol liyos hazman nichlal harbe bebas achas. An explanation of the idea of how is it possible for a lot of time to be included in one moment. Right? This is a paradoxical notion. Let's take Rosh Hashanah. Right? What we're saying is that the spiritual form of the time of the entire year, essentially the soul of the entire year and all the times that are going to be within the entire year, is created by God on Rosh Hashanah for the year. Or it's emanated, whatever the actual process is, it comes about from God on Rosh Hashanah. Now the thing is that it's very hard to understand how this works exactly, because it's not that it's not that a year exists in potential on Rosh Hashanah and then only occurs in the time span of 365 days, say. We noted last week how it's interesting that he says the 365-day year as opposed to the Jewish calendar, which is interesting. I didn't get an answer for that, by the way. Why he says specifically the solar calendar, which is not the Jewish calendar. It's interesting. But we're not saying that 365 days exist in Rosh Hashanah in potential, and then they are actually taking place over the course of the year. We're actually saying that in a sense, the 365 days take place on Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, God creates the 365 days all together at once, right? And so too on Rosh Chodesh, he creates 30 days at once, right? And et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, what does this mean exactly? What does it mean that the time is created together? Space is a little easier to conceive of. The question is even, I think, maybe even clearer in space, right? It's like you're saying that God creates the entire world, but he creates the entire world in a teacup, right? Or in Atlanta. The entire world is in Atlanta, right? So it's hard. Does that mean Atlanta grew or the world shrank, right? And the answer is neither. We're saying God creates, the initial creation, the soul of the entire world is contained within the space of Atlanta. So you have the world as it is, and God creates it initially in Atlanta. The question is, how is that possible, right? It seems paradoxical. Either Atlanta has to grow or the world has to shrink, right? That's not what we're saying. We're saying that the year as is, all 365 days, without shrinking, not in a contracted form or anything like that. The actual year is created all at once on Rosh Hashanah. What does that mean exactly? Right? It's still, in other words, or a different way of framing this question is, we still don't understand this process of what it means that time unfolds. It's a very strange notion in general. All of time exists all at once in the world of Akudim, and through this creation process, time slowly unfolds. But the thing is that if you think about it, the process of unfolding, or any verb that we use to describe the process, all processes are inherently connected with time in the human mind. It's very hard to conceive of a process without conceiving of time in the human mind. The truth is that in the abstract, there are such things. There is a process without time, right? Which we may get to as we learn through the chapter. But it's hard to even imagine it. So basically, we're saying that the creation of actual time takes place not in the scale of time, but in gradations. Time, in other words, time, or a different way of putting it, maybe that wasn't clear enough. Time is not created second by second per se. It is created second by second, but it's also created day by day, hour by hour, year by year, millennium by millennium. Right? So the question is what does it mean that time is also created by the year and not second by second? It's hard to conceive of what that means. What does it mean time is created by the year? Either the year has taken place or the year has not taken place, right? And Rosh Hashanah is only the first day of the year. So you're telling me the whole year has already taken place on Rosh Hashanah, it's only the first day of the year. Right? So what does it mean that the year is already taking place before the moment to moment has taken place? That there's a creation by the year before the creation of moment to moment? That's the question. That is our question. Okay, so continuing, last line of 368. Hu al pi ma shekdamnu l'mayla. This can be understood according to what we explained earlier in the discourse. Now we're on page 371. She'atzmusa yisborech l'mayla min hazman legamre. That God Himself is totally above time. Ela bebechinas heve tamid. Rather, He exists in a constant present. God always exists now. V'hei sheresh hazman hu machmas tzimtzum v'hispashtus shehaya b'ascholos brias ha'elam kama shenisbar le'il perek vav. And this is because the source of time is due to the contraction and the extension which took place at the beginning of the creation of the world. Contraction and extension. The Hebrew terms are tzimtzum and hispashtus, as was explained before in chapter 6. Now we have two loaded sentences here. Let's take them one by one. God exists beyond time and constantly in the present. The simplest way, right, we've been explaining that God, when we say God exists beyond time, we don't mean that He exists forever and unchanging within time. We mean that in principle, time does not apply to God, right? Which is not just a Hasidus idea, but is a philosophical idea, right? The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim and countless other Jewish philosophers will tell you the exact same thing, that the entire notion that God Himself exists within time doesn't make any sense.
His name explains it.
Pardon?
The name.
Yes, the name means past, present, and future at once. But why? Why is that so important? Why is that so inherent to the notion of God? Why is it inherent to God that He exists beyond time? It's not just that He happens to exist above time. It's that it is impossible for Him to be within time. That is not.
You couldn't create time if you were in it.
That's a given.
That's also a point. That's a fair point, right? But that's a different way of saying. That's a different way of saying that you already believe that literally everything is created by God, which is you may not know that, but that's a very Hasidic stance for you to take. Right? It's not necessarily the case. Why should it have to be that way? Why does time have to be created? This is part of why we say that time has to be created. But why does time have to be created? The answer is because time, generally speaking, and now we're going to get now to sort of the questions we've been putting off since the last chapter, which is really sort of what is time, which is a very difficult topic in Chassidus. Now, the fundamentally, time, at least in one understanding. So what I'm saying is that if you hold to this throughout the whole chapter, it may become very confusing. But at least, let's put it this way. One thing we know about time is that time is measurable through change. If nothing ever changes, time is not perceptible. Right? You would not be aware of the passage of time at all in a universe that was 100% static, in which nothing ever moved and nothing ever changed. Right? Time is measured, time is perceived. The passage of time is known because things change. And things change through time. Now, here's the thing. God does not and cannot change. Now, with a caveat, every time we say that God cannot do anything, in Chassidus, it's not really true. You should take it with a grain of salt. God can do anything, but according to human understanding, God as He is the God of logic, God as He is understandable at least, God as He makes sense, which Chassidus does not necessarily limit God to making sense, by the way, but God as He makes sense to us, God does not change. There is no change in God. Right, very simple to demonstrate. Right, there's different ways of demonstrating it, going back very far in history. But if God changes, right, it either has to be right. Here's one way of putting it. You say if He's changing, okay, so how is He changing? Is He changing for the better, for the worse, or is it staying the same? If it's staying the same, it's not really a change. So He doesn't really change.
Well, if it's blue or red, what difference does it make?
1 second. So if He changes, if he changes, and it's not better or worse,
Well, maybe his intentions don't change, but he changes.
He doesn't change.
No, because we are part of him, and we change. Everything around.
Not exactly.
He doesn't have parts.
Not exactly.
What?
He doesn't have parts.
But
We're not part of God.
We are an extension of him, right?
It's complicated. If we were really part of God 100%, as some sort of that would be a belief that is contrary to Judaism, as far as I'm aware. I don't know if there's any legitimate Torah belief that actually says the world is part of God. Okay. God is beyond the world in Judaism.
That's pantheism.
The question is what is the world? Now, the world, according to Hasidus, is many different things. It's an expression of God. It's a creation. You have to ask what the creation is. What's the nature of the creation? It's true that the creation doesn't exist independently of God. But ultimately, God himself is not defined by anything in the creation, according to the Hasidic perspective at least. So the idea that we are part of God is not really true. That would be, God has a body, God has parts. All of these things are not really considered part of normative Judaism. I don't want to get into God having into God having a body now. We could do that
that's not
forever. We had a whole different. We've spoken about this before in this class when we were doing other principles of faith. We can't do that now. Yeah.
Okay.
No, please.
God is everything, right? We were just having this conversation in the parking lot.
Yeah.
So, I know that Hasidus has this idea that God is not physical.
Correct.
But,
I would say Judaism in general has the idea God is not physical.
Okay, so.
I think if you know something else, please.
No, I don't know, but I'm just.
Yeah.
I struggle with the idea of God being everything and God not being something.
That was the.
I missed a bunch of classes.
I was going to say that was a topic of a broad part of our discourse here. Seriously, if you go back to the earlier chapters of this discourse, that's what a lot of it is about. It's struggling with. It's struggling with. The whole discourse is delving into. We did many chapters about God's wisdom, which essentially, wisdom as the highest creation can be. You can apply that to any creation, right? Essentially, in other words, the whole question of God having parts, God having aspects, God having faculties, all of these sorts of things. We spent a lot of time talking about that. It's a very deep and complex subject. And unfortunately, I don't know if I can get into it now.
Okay.
It may be too much of a tangent. So, what was I saying? Oh yes. Okay. So God the change is either better or worse, or neither. Right? If it's neither, either it's not a change, right? Or the change is meaningless. And would you purport to God that He needs to make a meaningless change? Right? In other words, what purpose could there possibly be? What reason could there be for making a meaningless change? Right? This is assuming that God does reasonable things. That's the whole assumption. Now, if God's getting better, that means that before He wasn't God, because God is the best of all things. And if He's getting worse, that means He's becoming not God, because He's not the greatest of all things. Right? That's one way you could look at it.
But then
There's
you
lots
can
of
say,
different
why
ways
did He create the world if He doesn't change anything?
Sorry?
You can say, why did He create the world if He doesn't change anything?
Haven't we spoken in previous class about whether creating the world constitutes a change to God?
Maybe we did, but I'm old and forgetful.
That's true. L'chaim. We're talking about God Himself. We're not talking about the world. We're talking about changes to Him Himself. If God Himself changes, we're not talking about the world.
All right. We're
talking about God Himself changing. The bottom line is that they're at least logically speaking, if we are to ascribe logic to God, the entire idea that God as the source of all things, God as the greatest of all things, God as the most high, God as the root and source of all that is. Any of these descriptions or definitions of what we mean when we say God preclude that He should exist within time. Because it doesn't make sense, it's hard to see how God could change, or what it would mean that God would change. Because God is absolute perfection, He is absolute wholeness, absolute completeness, and there is no room for change in such a situation. Very generally speaking. I'm not speaking rigorously now. It's not a philosophy class. I'm saying that's the gist of the argument. The gist of the argument is that God, by definition, that's what I'm trying to show you. God, because he is God, he does not exist within time. Rather, as we said here, he exists as a continuous existence. God just is. And it doesn't make sense for God will be or God was. Right? In other words, God will be in the future something other than what he is, right? Because either that thing is less perfect or more perfect, and neither a less perfect nor a more perfect thing makes sense when you're speaking about God changing and that being God, right? The whole thing doesn't make sense. So God, by nature of being God, God in his godness exists beyond time and above time.
So when we speak about God in the Torah, shouldn't we say God? Like we say God spoke to Moses. Shouldn't it be God
it's also
is currently speaking with Moses because he's outside of time? So we shouldn't be saying the Torah shouldn't have said.
The real question is, what does it mean God spoke with Moses in the first place?
All right, God. Well,
once you understand what it means he spoke with Moses, maybe it was within time, right? Okay. The question is, how can God...
How does it
according to this understanding, in other words, let me tell you what you're really asking. Okay. According to this understanding, it doesn't make sense that God can speak to Moses. Okay. God himself. You're right. Okay. And it's a problem. And those problems are the problems that we opened this whole discourse with like 2 years ago. Okay. So that sort of problem is the problem we've been wrestling with this whole discourse. It doesn't make sense that God can speak. What does it even mean that God speaks? That's part of what we've been discussing. And it's a good question. You're right. It's a good question.
I mean, not just speak, does anything, really.
Yeah, I agree.
When God does anything, we say in the past tense, but...
Yeah,
according to this,
or the idea of even isn't doing something a limitation on God itself, that God should act. What does it even mean that God acts if he is pure perfection? Absolutely, very good questions.
I want to say something. I mean, I know this entered, and I don't know what exactly we discussed, but it seems like it's relevant. Yesterday we had a class with the rabbi.
Yeah,
and he presented a very interesting concept. And we mentioned once, I mean, that obviously, God created the world. He first created the time, then everything came.
Yeah.
And the thing is how is the world being maintained? I mean, we said that God is actually, not creating everything from the beginning every time, but He sustains.
Mm-hmm.
And we gave the example of the Shor Muad, otherwise the Shor Muad is not going to be Shor Muad. So he presented Shor Muad. So he presented a different concept.
The goring ox,
which according to the course, this is the concept. And it says God creates the present, but he creates past on the very same time. And what is the example? If I'll come to you and I will create a new past, because God is like able to do everything. He is able to create the past. So we say, you know what? Within a minute ago, I created a past which is different than everything that you thought you would. And you wouldn't even remember that. Because since I'm creating everything from now, I can also create the time now, or create the past now. So that's a little bit of a different concept, because your past may be relevant because God is actually creating the past right now as well.
Well, Mahmoud Abbas.
It's not like Mahmoud Abbas, God forbid. I forgot, it's by Ashkacha Pratis that we're learning about time, and the JLI course this week was about time, right? We're right on time. It shows that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? Forgot about that.
There are no coincidences in Judaism.
Of course not.
Never.
Okay. The second thing that we said. So the first thing is that God exists beyond time. Basically clear. The important thing to realize is that God, when we say God exists beyond time, we don't mean like imagine a table, but the table has existed forever and will exist forever. Right? That's not what we're saying. Because there's nothing about being a table that says that time cannot affect you. If the table happened to have existed forever and will exist forever, that's what we call, that's happenstance or an accident. There's nothing about the table that makes it that it has to exist forever. On the contrary, most physical things, if not all physical things, eventually decay and fall apart. God, by definition, because he is God, exists beyond time. That's the difference. So it's not that he exists forever within time. He exists beyond time by dint of what he is. Because he is God, he has no limitation within time. That's the first thing we said here. The second thing here that we read, I'll read it again. The reason why God exists beyond time. So we say God exists beyond time because he does not change. Why is it that God is beyond change? Because the source of time, the source of change, is because of what is called the tzimtzum and the hispashtus, which occurred at the beginning of the creation of the world. So let's turn back the clock on our class and go back to our discussion that we once had about the story time, the Kabbalistic story of creation, which we've spoken about in this class. In the beginning, we learn in the Kabbalah, there was God and his light, or God and his name, it's called elsewhere. And God desired to create a world, so he took the light and he moved the light to the side, and what was left over was an empty void. And into the empty void, he took a ray of the original light, and he shone the light into the void. And with that light, this ray that he shone back into the void, he created all of the spiritual worlds and the physical world. That is what created the universe, the Kabbalistic story of creation. Now, that story of creation basically has two general steps. It has more, but we'll say it has two general steps. The first step is the tzimtzum. The first step of all of creation, interestingly, intriguingly, is a negative action, in a sense. It's not that God emanates the light. The light was always emanated, right? The story begins, there was God in his light, which is interesting. The first step of creation, that was before anything was created. The first step of creation is the removal of the light. What's called the tzimtzum, the contraction, which is basically, to summarize very briefly from longer discussions we've had in this class, God was allowing for there to be room for something other than him to exist. God was allowing there to be something outside of his subjectivity. If you'll recall, we described it as before the contraction, before the tzimtzum, before the light was removed, no matter what there was, whatever it was said, I am God. Everything was inside his subjectivity. Everything was inside himself. For there to even be a possibility for something to exist outside of him, apart from him, for something to be that was not him, there had to be a tzimtzum. The light had to be contracted and removed. The second step of the creation is the sending of the ray of the light back in, which you can call the hispashtus, I believe is what he's referring to. The extension of the light back into the empty space, quote unquote, created by the tzimtzum. Now, putting aside for a moment what some of you may remember from earlier classes, that the tzimtzum is non-literal and doesn't really occur in the way that it sounds like it's occurring in the original story.
Chabad approach, right?
This is the Chabad approach, correct. Putting aside for a moment the fact that the tzimtzum is non-literal, I believe the general Chassidic approach, not just the Chabad approach.
Yeah, Chassidic.
We're going to talk about the tzimtzum like it's literal, because the non-literal tzimtzum is a whole other
But it made me just think
kettle of fish.
that in order to create a physical world, he had to push aside a spiritual world. It means the spiritual is more dense than the physical.
But we're talking about the creation of the spiritual worlds also. The creation of the spiritual worlds was equally as impossible as the creation of the physical worlds before the tzimtzum. Okay, so putting aside that the tzimtzum is non-literal and not worrying about that aspect of things. This is a very difficult. I've warned you already. This is a very difficult sugya in Chassidus. I'm going to try and do my best from my understanding, which is far from perfect. So, imagine you have a teacher and a student, right? It's like this. Imagine every act of creation is like a teacher teaching his student. The act of creation is like a teacher teaching his student. Why is that so? Why is the act of creation like a teacher teaching a student? Why is this the metaphor? Because the act of creation, essentially, you are going from one true, subjective, private existence, which is called God, where God can say about himself, Anochi, I. There is a self there. In order to create, God has to basically create another self from himself. Right? This is one. That's the reason why in many works of Kabbalah, the act of creation is described as a yichud, as physical intimacy, like between a husband and a wife, is also a Kabbalistic metaphor for creation, because it's the same idea. It's reproduction, essentially. For God to create, he has to create a self, but that is not himself. Right? So he has to take something that is of him and make it into something that is of something else. The non-literal tzimtzum means that never really happens, because nothing is outside of God, by the way, as a footnote. Because nothing is ever outside of God, so the fact that the other one is outside of him is an illusion, it's not real. That's a footnote for the people who are worried about that. So you have a teacher teaching his student. It's a similar process, right? Because you have a teacher with his understanding, and I have a student. The student, let's assume the student is a blank slate with regards to this subject, right? You have a physics teacher, he's teaching science, or a math teacher, right? The student is a blank slate in the class. There is no existence of math in the student's mind. The goal of the teacher is he has math, but his math is part of who he is, right? It's in his mind, it's integrated into his understanding and his worldview, and he has to recreate, essentially, a self, assuming that his entire self is his knowledge of math. He has to recreate a self in a different place. He has to take what is his and essentially put it over there and have it be totally separate from him. Once I put it in the student can leave and never see me again, and the student will have it, right?
It's like a kind of unsee what I'm here.
Yeah. Correct. He has it. Here's the thing. So this process has, in the actual teaching, has 3 steps. 3 steps not counting the starting positions. The starting position, right? So really you could say 4 steps maybe if you wanted, right? The first step, which is not really a step, is the teacher before he's created, right? The teacher has the knowledge, the student has nothing, and the teacher there's a teacher and his knowledge alone, and there's nothing there. To give the knowledge over, there's 3 steps. Number 1, the teacher has to take the knowledge that he's going to give, and in his own mind, he has to have that knowledge ready, because in the knowledge's natural state, it's not really ready to be given over. It's integrated into his whole worldview and his whole understanding, right? He may know a million things about math, and he needs to teach only one today. So he has to take that one thing and have it in his own understanding. The second step is when he says it, and the knowledge leaves him, but now the knowledge is in an intermediate state. The knowledge is now in a state where, on the one hand, it's outside of him, but on the other hand, the knowledge has not been assimilated into the student's mind yet, right? It hasn't really created anything yet. It's still only an expression of the teacher, right? I have not yet created another person that knows math, which is the goal of this act of creation, right? All I have is I've taken my knowledge and I've put it out, I've extended it outward. It's now outside of me. But another person who knows math, that reality has not yet been created.
There's loose math in the air.
Exactly. And the third step is when the student assimilates the math into their own understanding. And now the student has it. And now there are two people in the room that know math. Now there's the teacher and the student. Okay? 3 steps. So again, the 3 steps. First, I have the idea in my head. Then I put it outward, but it has not yet been accepted by the student. And then the student has accepted it. These 3 steps accompany every act of creation. Every act of creation that God performs when He creates the world has these 3 steps. Okay? Now we're going to translate some of these concepts into scary Hebrew words. The mathematical knowledge. Well, what is a thing? What is a thing? What is the person with math in his head? Everything that exists in all the spiritual worlds and the physical worlds, it says in Chassidus, has a soul and a body. Or a different word, which is soul and body, is neshama and guf in Hebrew. And in a different terminology, but essentially meaning roughly the same thing, everything is an ur in a kli. Everything is a light in a vessel. The light is the soul. The vessel is what allows that life force to exist persistently outside of its source. And we're going to explain how that works in the metaphor, so you really understand it in a second. Everything is light and vessel. The teacher, this is how you get from one level to the next level. Like, for example, let's say you're going from... Let's say if you were speaking about spiritual metaphysics, if you're talking about in Kabbalah, let's say you're going from chesed to gvura of Atzilus, right? Because it's a process, right? The students follow one after the other in certain understandings of the Kabbalah. So you're going from chesed to gvura. So how does it work, right? Or from one world to another. You could say even more generally. You're going from Atzilus to Bria, right? From one world to a different world. The process is like the teacher teaching the student. It has 3 steps. So everything, the lower level is a light in a vessel. The higher level is a light in a vessel. Okay? Everything is a soul and a body. Everything has, the soul and the body is very important, which is why I'm mentioning it. This is actually, the soul and the body is really the most important part of this whole metaphor, in a way. So to create the next level, there's a process. And the process goes as follows. First, there is an emanation of light. The emanation of light begins within its source. Like the teacher has the idea before he's taught it. Right? Or a different metaphor that's given all over in Chassidus is the ray of the sun in the sun. Before the light comes out of the sun, it exists within the sun. Right? We're not speaking... physically per se. We're saying that the light has a source in the sun, so the light must implicitly exist in the sun. Whether it exists how it does outside of the sun or not, the light has a source in the sun, so the light must be there even before it leaves the surface of the sun. It's a different metaphor. That's just a metaphor. So the teaching of math exists within the teacher. The light is emanated, but it has not yet left its source. Then there is a second step. The second step is what we usually refer to when we say something emanated, something gave off light. What does that mean? What is light? Light is an expression of the thing that is not the thing itself. That's what we mean when we say light in Chassidus. The thing gives off light. It expresses itself. The math teacher gives the math over. And the math is in the air, as Ronnie said, right? The light is expressed. Now the thing is that light alone, this is why our light and vessel become important. Light alone cannot become another thing like the source. The problem with light, the problem with an expression, is that an expression is always inherently not a thing in and of itself, but the expression of something else. That's by its nature. It's an expression. Right? So in other words, the words of math that a math teacher teaches can never be a student of math that possesses mathematical knowledge. Right? For obvious reasons. Because it's not a student. It's not a thing. All it is an expression of the math teacher. All the math teacher doing is expressing himself. Right?
There's a nice example for that. It's like, the perfume oil and scents in the air.
Yeah.
So this is like,
Sure. Sure.
But
You could use a different metaphor, by the way. You could even say the math professor writing a math textbook is the exact same thing, right? You have the ideas as they are traveling from his mind onto the page, and then the page is like the student, right? It's absorbed, it's set, it's now become a thing, right? You could say a similar metaphor that way. But anyway, so one second, and I'll finish it. So just a second. The light is not a thing by nature. By nature, it's only an expression. Right? For something to become a thing, a new thing, there has to be a vessel. And the vessel, what is a vessel? A vessel, or a body, is essentially a way for light to be persistently expressed apart from its source. The light basically separates, or congeals is maybe even a better verb. The light hardens and coarsens and becomes something which is separate from the original person. Like when the words of the math teacher enter the student's mind and they become part of the student. The student is now like the teacher. There are now two people in the room who know math. The student, as the vessel, is now light and vessel. You have the mathematical knowledge from the teacher, but it's not an expression of the teacher anymore. The expression of the teacher has now become a new thing. It has now become the student. Now, there are now two things like the original thing. Right? This is the process of creation. And this is the process of creation according to Kabbalah. So again, the three steps in the Kabbalistic language is you have the light as it is within its source. You have the light as it is being expressed, but it's still only light, so it's not really apart from its source. The light is still expressing the source. It has not yet become another thing, a separate being. Only when light and vessel, or soul and body, come together, only when there is vessel, have they become two separate things. Okay, what were you going to say, Darryl?
So the question now is,
Yeah.
teachers, is he teaching his student?
Yeah.
Or does the student already have the knowledge but it's not unlocked? And all he's doing is unlocking it.
Oh, you're asking deep questions now that aren't connected to our metaphor. It's a good question. It's a fair question. It's a different question for a different day. It's a good question. In fact, I think
It's
that
semantics.
No.
it's not for now is what it is.
I think this question is really cool. But
Yeah.
does the student doesn't accept it the same way? Everyone's different, right?
Yeah.
So it's a different thought. It's a whole different.
Correct.
It's not the same. It's
Correct.
It's different every single time.
Correct. And you would say that that's part of the effect of the vessel. When light, that's
different vessel.
Yes, correct. It's a different vessel which affects the light differently, absolutely. Okay. Which is a very astute observation of you. Correct. So the individuality.
I don't see math the same way you see.
That's partially answer his question.
Yeah.
Yes, in a way, sure. It's connected. The individuality of the student comes about, the student's understanding of the subject comes about through the vessel, right? Which indicates, which leads directly into the next point I was going to make, which is going to be a tough point to make in 5 minutes, but we're going to try. That leads directly into the next point I was going to make, which is that the light, once it has become part of the vessel, is at a distant remove from the light as it originally was. The vessel, in a sense, always corrupts the light. Or a different way of putting it, corrupt is very judgmental. Corrupt is a very judgmental word. Yes, conceals. The vessel's job is really to reveal the light, right? Or a different way of putting it is, the student wants to understand. Right? The student doesn't want to obscure the mathematical knowledge. The student wants to have the mathematical knowledge. The problem with the student having the mathematical knowledge is that the student and the professor are not at the same level. The professor has been studying math for 30 years and has a PhD. The student may be a first-year college student, a high school student. They're simply not in the same place. And so, when the student, even the student when he is revealing the light. Even the student, when he is trying his best to grasp the original concept, it is inevitable that his way of grasping it conceals it as well. That the light is concealed, the light is hidden within the vessel. Now, 4 minutes. There's a concept. Now, understanding these three levels, which we're going to have to review again and get back to next week, because I haven't even got to the thing that's in our mimer yet. Now, when the light is in the vessel, Now, having now understood this process of creation, we can understand that the light, when it's in the vessel, is invariably concealed and of a lower state than it was in its original source, right? Certainly when we're going downward in Seder Hishtalshelus, which is what we're describing in the analog. That's what we're really describing. We're describing the process of creating lower levels, lower realities. Right? Different tzimtzumim, different contractions. It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the light is lower than its source. And there is a phenomenon which is part of what makes the thing live, called Ratzei V'shuv, as called in Chassidus. There's a phenomenon called Ratzei V'shuv. Ratzei V'shuv can be translated as approaching and retreating, rushing towards and returning backwards. The metaphor often given is the flickering candle that's on the wick. The candle surges upwards and the wick pulls it downwards. And then it flickers upwards and the wick pulls it downwards. What described in Tanya, right? You have the approaching and receding. Ratzei v'shuv. What is Ratzei v'shuv? Ratzei v'shuv is inherent to the nature of light and vessel. And the way it works is like this. Light, because it is light, by its nature, light essentially wants to be expressing its original source. The mathematical knowledge, by its nature, let's say by the words the teacher uses or the way the teacher gives it over, it is an expression of the teacher. It belongs to him. It's expressing the higher source. Therefore, when it is integrated into the lower source, and when it becomes part of the student, it's inherently not a perfect fit. The light, and it's a good thing that it's not a perfect fit, as I'll explain in a moment. The light is not a perfect fit for the vessel. The light is not comfortable in the vessel. Light always wants to return to its source, which is another way of saying that light by its inherent nature wants to be of the source that emanated it, not of the level where it is concealed by the vessel. We'll talk about this more next week, God willing. But so the light, when it's within the vessel, even though it doesn't leave the vessel, right, undergoes a certain flickering motion. There's a certain motion of the light. The light is not still. The light is unhappy. The light is uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable in both phases, which is what drives it. It's almost like a good metaphor, if anybody here knows physics, is the way that light is actually from light, which is the way that light is propelled through a vacuum, right? There's two fields, and the fields are alternating, right? And it's never comfortable, which is why it keeps being propelled. It's never in one. There's never a rest state. It keeps being propelled. It keeps being propelled forward. It's the same thing with the soul of anything, and we're talking here even about a human soul or the soul of an inanimate object, or the light of Atzilus as it's in Bria. It counts for almost pretty much across the board when you talk about light and vessel. There's Ratzei v'shuv, there's approaching and there's receding, right? The light is put into the vessel, but the light is not comfortable with the vessel. It wants to return to its source. So the light rushes away from the vessel. The soul wants to have as little to do with the body as possible in any given thing. However, the further it gets away from the body, the more it realizes that it needs to return to the body. Because as it gets further and further away from the body, it ceases to exist and to be what it is within the vessel. And so, as it approaches, it recedes. And as it gets close, as it gets further and further out of the vessel, it realizes how much it wants to go back. And then the deeper and deeper it goes in the vessel, it realizes how much it wants to leave. So you have Ratzei, which is the approach to its source, away, out of the vessel, the upward flickering of the candle. And you have the Shuv, which is the return, the receding, which is the light becoming and identifying with the vessel. Right? I'll give a brief metaphor, a different metaphor for this, and then we'll end. A famous metaphor that is used by many teachers of Chassidus, and which students in Chabad yeshivas understand nowadays, is the metaphor of a shliach, which is mentioned in this class before. Right? The Rebbe tells someone that you're going on shlichus to Marrakesh. You're opening up a Chabad house in Marrakesh, and you'll be, for the Jews there in Morocco, the 3.5 Jews that are left in Morocco, you'll be the Jewish life of Marrakesh. So the chassid goes to Marrakesh. Now, the thing is that the chassid, when he's in Marrakesh, which is, in this metaphor, the light as it's outside of its source, because it's not by the Rebbe. The Rebbe is, so to speak, the source, right? Being by the Rebbe is being within the source. A chassid, as he's away, undergoes a cycle, and the cycle goes like this. His intense desire is to go back to the Rebbe. Now, his desire to go back to the Rebbe and to not be in Marrakesh is what makes him a good shliach when he's in Marrakesh, which is why Ratzoi V'Shuv is vital for the life of the thing. Because the vessel essentially is dead. The entire relationship that the lower level has with the higher level is through the light. And if the light identifies fully with the vessel, the thing is essentially cut off entirely. It has no connection to, if the lower level has no connection to the higher, to the higher level, right? It's if the student so fully assimilates the information that he doesn't need the professor anymore. And basically, in fact, really the worst level of this would be the student saying that I don't need to listen to the professor, I know everything on my own, I only need myself, right? That's full vesselization. That doesn't accomplish anything. Now there's not two people that know math, now there's only one person that knows math, right? It defeats the entire purpose. The entire purpose is to become a separate thing, but to maintain a connection, to be the creation of the previous level. So a shliach who's totally 100% comfortable in Marrakesh is a very bad sign. Right? Not good. The shliach, when he's in Marrakesh, should desire to go back to the Rebbe. I don't want to be here in Marrakesh and teaching Aleph Beis to North Africans. I want to be back by the Rebbe. I want to hear sichas. I want to be at Fabrengens. I want to have a rich spiritual life for myself. I don't want to be in Marrakesh, right? So he goes back, let's say. Really, in the metaphor, the light never leaves the vessel, so he never leaves Marrakesh, right? But let's say he goes back, for Rosh Hashanah to the Rebbe, right? The more he approaches to the Rebbe, and he goes and he sits by the Rebbe in Rosh Hashanah, and the whole Tishrei, what does the Rebbe talk about? The Rebbe talks about how dare any Jew stay in New York. They have to go and they have to do their mission in Marrakesh. You can't stay here. Right? So the chassid, when he's in New York, the closer he gets to the Rebbe, the more the Rebbe tells him that your responsibility is not to be here with me. Your responsibility is to be over there in Marrakesh and help the Jews in North Africa. This is why shluchim are crazy, by the way. This is why any shliach is a little. They're a little. Yeah, they're a little. One of the reasons. This is why they have. This is why they're a little neither here nor there, maybe. Right? So the closer you get to the Rebbe, so his whole desire when he's in Marrakesh is to be close to the Rebbe, so that he can get away from all the irritating things in his Chabad house and he can have spiritual sustenance for himself. And the more spiritual sustenance he gets for himself, the more he realizes, oh, this is horrible, I should be in Marrakesh, right? God forbid I should be getting spiritual sustenance for myself. I should be out there in the vessel, right? This is the Ratzoi V'Shuv. So the closer he is to the Rebbe, the more he realizes he has to be in Marrakesh. Then he heads back to Marrakesh. But the more involved he is in Marrakesh, the more he wants to go and be by the Rebbe. Right? Ratzoi V'Shuv. This is what maintains, so this allows him to be two things. This allows him to be a separate creation, but the separate creation has a connection and is the son of, and is the progeny of the source. He represents the source. Right? So again, if there was no vessel, if there was only the Rebbe's teachings and there was no shliach to take them to Marrakesh, then there wouldn't be a separate creation. Right? You can't reach Marrakesh that way. The teachings of the Rebbe, because the Rebbe himself can't go to Marrakesh, because he's the Rebbe, he has to stay in New York and around the world, or whatever his Rebbes do. His teachings can't reach Marrakesh. He needs a separate person from him. But the separate person from him can't be just completely separate, because then it's not the Rebbe's teachings reaching Marrakesh. Right? It has to be a person that has this relationship with him. So the nature, how is that relationship maintained? That the person is separate, but he still has this connection. It's light in a vessel, and the light is constantly oscillating towards, away, out of the vessel, into the vessel. And it's the exact same thing with creation. God wants to create something separate from himself, but everything that God creates inherently is of God and desires to return to its source, desires to be closer to God. And when God creates something, he creates it light in a vessel, and the light is constantly in a state of Ratzoi V'Shuv. It's constantly moving towards God and away from God. Now, our Maimer hasn't even mentioned Ratzoi V'Shuv and may not mention Ratzoi V'Shuv at all, so the entire connection of this to our discourse I will be explaining next week, God willing.
But I saw Mati Velo Mati somewhere here.